to the History Through Film podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Allen, and for this first episode, I'd like to introduce myself and explain a little bit about what you can expect from this podcast and others to come. The title of the podcast comes from a class I've been teaching at Spring Hill High School located in Spring Hill, Kansas. I've been teaching there for about 13 years now. And really, the class idea came from, my own experience with movies. I'm a kid of the 70s, and some of my earliest memories include going to the theater to see films like Midway, Jaws, King Kong, and of course Star Wars. Some of those even took place at the great Glenwood Theater on 95th and Metcalf, and even downtown at the Midland. In fact, I saw Empire Strikes Back there when it was first released back in 1980. And ever since then, I just fell in love with movies. I always enjoyed going to them, always taking other people to them. And one of the things that I always loved to do as a kid is drag my dad to the movies. And he was always a good sport about probably sitting through not the best films, but also sitting through some of the greatest. So I took this love of movies that I had, and when I became a teacher, I thought, if I'm teaching history, and most history teachers sometimes use film, how could I maybe include it in my classes but use it in a different way? So I created this class called History Through Film. It's a non-traditional history class, and I believe it stems from my belief that film should be studied, and not just how film is made or why they're made, but films from the past and films that are also based on history. I look at these older films and think, why can't we analyze them? Why can't we use them just like primary source documents? Why can't we use newer films based on older events as secondary source documents? That's really where the idea from this class came from. I started gathering ideas from my own interest and experience. I took some college classes on film, even some literature classes that were based on analyzing and writing reviews of films. I looked at local high schools and other high schools around the nation to see if they offered a class like this. Some did, but most were based on just historical films, things like The Patriot or Saving Private Ryan, or other films based on like The Alamo. And those aren't bad, but I wanted to do something just a little different, something different than maybe other typical high school history classes were doing. So I started reading some more books on the topics and started gathering ideas to create a curriculum. Eventually, I got it approved by the board, and I started teaching this class in a way that not only catered to my interest and love of films, but also trying to reach out to students and see, can they get interested in films that were non-traditional history ones? And let's just see what happens. So that's where this class has kind of a twist to it. It's slightly different. Others maybe focus primarily on history-based movies, but we do something a little different in my class. Most people are curious about the objective of the class. Is it truly a class just based on history movies? Well, not really. Sometimes it is, but what we also do is we look at themes of the films, motifs, symbolism, and of course the history, but from a different perspective. We do study historical films, but we also study fictional films that are made in specific times in history. So for instance, our main focus is looking at how does society influence films, and how do films influence society? For example, in the 1930s, we don't really look at strictly Great Depression films or films that deal with prohibition, but we'll look at gangster films of the 1930s. Why were they popular? How did society influence them? And how did audiences react to those films? In other words, we look at these fictional gangster films and see how society actually influenced them. Most of them you'll find are based on real events in history. And of course, they were also influenced by the Great Depression and Prohibition. After all, that's where the violence grew, from Prohibition. As we move into the 1940s, for example, I focus on World War II, but we take a different approach to it. We look more at the propaganda aspect of World War II. And we might focus on films like The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin. where he, of course, is mocking Hitler and other dictators. Or we may look at Casablanca and see, how is this a propaganda film? Not only is it one of the greatest films of all time and a classic, but most high school students haven't seen that film. And so one of my goals is to expose them to some great American classic films. When we get into the 50s, we might focus on nuclear war and the Red Scare. We might look at the fear of communism. Maybe I'll use films like the original Godzilla or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and we just take a different look at the time. How did the paranoia of the 1950s and the fear of nuclear war influence these classic science fiction films? When we move into the 60s, we'll look at topics such as civil rights, the counterculture movement, and we'll make our way into Vietnam. And we'll watch some films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner or In the Heat of the Night, and maybe some Vietnam films that may have been made in the 70s or 80s, but they really reflect what was going on in the 60s. And other comedies like The Graduate is a great way to show students what their generation was like, but back in the 60s. Currently, I teach 3 sections of history through film. For my freshman and sophomore students, I teach an introduction to history through film. And with that, I try to teach them how to analyze films. And sometimes we'll use films such as Star Wars to look at the mythology and maybe study the hero's journey, which is very common in other adventure films like Harry Potter, The Lion King, and so on. We may also look at other films that have to do primarily with the Great Depression, and maybe films that have a sports theme like Race or 42. When I get into my history through film class, we usually treat that chronologically, starting in the late 1800s into the 1900s, making our way into the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, etc. And then my history through film 2 class is a little different. We really focus on themes, symbolisms, and motifs of films. It's more of a philosophical class. We might watch a film like Blade Runner to try to analyze what's the true meaning of that film. What does it mean to be human? Or look at films like The Planet of the Apes, the original, and see how that science fiction film ties in themes of civil rights, except we're talking about humans versus apes. And we may even look at 2001: A Space Odyssey, or even tackle some other films that are more recent with their historical events. And I am lucky in this class to have the opportunity to show some films that, again, most students don't take the opportunity to watch on their own. Before, we've watched The Godfather 1 and 2, and those are classic American movies that not only had a reflection of what the 70s were about, but there's also a lot of symbolism and themes that students can possibly relate to when looking at other films that they want to compare it to. In my class, I do have a parent permission form because some of these films are R-rated, but usually that's because of some violence or language, and I always try to stay away from nudity. People always ask me, by the way, how is it that I can show a rated R movie? Well, parents usually understand that in an educational setting, we tend to have what I consider adult conversations about some of these themes or storylines. And I think it's very productive. I would much rather talk to them about what they're seeing in the film, whether it's war or whether it's violence due to a historical event, than them watching it on their own and wondering, well, I wonder why that happened, and then never pursuing that idea or thought. So the question remains, why did I create this podcast? Aren't there a million podcasts out there about films and also a million of podcasts about history? Yeah, there is. And of course, I listen to a lot of podcasts to get my ideas and to be influenced by other people that are talking about films. I seem to think that I'm pretty well versed in a lot of movies and history, but you keep learning as a teacher. And of course, the best way that I can learn is by reading and listening to other podcasts to learn more and more about movies and history. But one thing that I did find is that there wasn't exactly a podcast based on a class like this. So When I decided to branch out and start this podcast, I thought, why not incorporate my love of movies, what I'm learning outside of my classroom, and also bring that all together and use this podcast as a teaching tool for my students, and also be able to bring in other teachers who are film fans and discuss what they love about movies. And in fact, that's something that we'll do on this podcast from time to time. I'll be bringing in other history teachers, other teachers in my building. Sometimes I'll bring other guests in from people that I know and personal friends, just people who like to talk about movies, and perhaps they are an expert in a particular film or two. They come in and we'll talk about it, a little bit about the history, or maybe just talk about why this famous film or awesome film is great and talk about it. So really, this is an extension of my History Through Film class. And in fact, I plan on making it part of my class and inviting students to come on in and join us on some of these podcasts. So finally, what will this podcast exactly focus on? Well, that's still kind of up in the air, but I will say that some of the podcasts will focus on many of the films I use in class. In fact, one of the first ones that you'll hear about is the 1930s gangster films, and talk about how, again, Prohibition and the Great Depression influenced those films, and how they, of course, became very popular among audiences. Some of the films my guests will choose, and like I said, they may be non-traditional historical films that you might think of, but rather just films that are popular, films that are fun, and films that perhaps we all love and we just want to talk about. However, we can take just about any film and talk about how it was made, the story, and perhaps the historical context of its setting and when it was made. What's going on in the world at the time that the movie was made, or perhaps when the movie was set, the time that it was set in? What was in the news? What was the culture like, the entertainment, and just about every other aspect of 70s, 80s, 90s, and films into the 2000s. Periodically, we'll have special shows, maybe focusing on favorite films like Raiders of the Lost Ark or Star Wars, and maybe such topics as discussing franchises or specific genre of films like sports. And then it's always fun to talk about some of those sequels that don't suck. And that's exactly what we're going to title it, Sequels That Don't Suck. And I'm hoping that you, as a listener, may learn something about favorite films that you watch, and maybe something about the history, when they were made, and what time period they were set in. I'm also hoping our listeners will learn a little bit more about the movies they love, and perhaps a specific time in history. Well, that pretty much wraps up this first episode of History Through Film. I hope that I've given you an idea of what to look forward to in future episodes. If you are interested, please subscribe to this podcast, and you can always reach me on Twitter at History Through Film. That's History, THRU, Film. Again, I'm Curtis Allen, and thanks for joining me on the History Through Film podcast. And I'm hoping you join us on our first official episode coming soon.